Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So we were a little slow, a couple minutes slow getting started. I'm Liz Veazey from Solar United Neighbors, work on our policy team, and I'm really excited about this model virtual power plant, or I think we're also trying to call it distributed power plant. We think that maybe is more easily accessible term, but we do maybe need to do some more workshopping and focus grouping around some of that stuff. But our model DPP or VPP tariff and legislation, we're really excited to have this sort of invite only meeting for our friends and colleagues and folks around the country interested in working on this and learning more to help sort of launch this as a resource. And yeah, we're really excited to see lots of folks here today that we work with all across the country. And I think many folks who have helped us develop these materials over the last few months. So not going to name all, there's a lot of people. I don't even know if I know all the names of all the people, but really appreciate everyone who's joining us today and everyone who's given us feedback to this point. And we look forward to more ideas and more feedback. So yeah, really appreciate everybody. And I think today we're mostly going to have presentations from some of the folks who've been really digging in and working and developing this. And so I'm mostly just going to pass it over to them. I guess for some framing in terms of Solar United Neighbors and like why we care about this and who we are. If you're not familiar with Sun, we're a community of people building a new energy system with rooftop solar at the cornerstone. So we help people go solar through solar co-ops, buying clubs, and then help them join together and fight for their energy rights, fight for better solar policies. So we really see virtual power plants, distributed power plants, and that policy as an important way to ensure our vision of a clean, equitable energy system that directs control and benefits back to local communities with solar on every roof and money in every pocket. So yeah, I guess we should just go ahead and get started and dig in. So Baron, I think or am I passing it to Mark first to give us a little context?
You are.
All right, Mark, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. I'm Mark Duda, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Sun Action Network and also president of the Hawaii PV Coalition. So in both of those roles, I'm highly exposed to regulation and its impact on DER deployment and utilization, a relationship that people in this community are all too aware of. But I got involved specifically with VPPs in a Hawaii proceeding where we spent half a decade developing a program that doesn't work. There's a lot of reasons for that, but ultimately it goes back to the typical combination of delay, personnel turnover, general lack of understanding of the technology involved, and insufficient interest from certain key stakeholders, which resulted in a final program that just isn't viable. Hawaii has a 100% battery attachment rate on new solar installations. So the lack of a viable program there means this is an enormous missed opportunity to use customer-sited resources to provide grid services cost effectively. So kind of along the way, it occurred to me that maybe there's a better way. Excuse me. If we could develop a VPP program structure that becomes the default, like a model tariff, rather than an idiosyncratically developed bespoke program, in 100 different jurisdictions or more, the odds of emerging from these regulatory proceedings with a viable outcome would meaningfully increase. So kind of in parallel with this, my colleague Brad Albert was working at the Department of Energy's loan program offices in the VPP department. And through Brad, I learned that Department of Energy was working on a pathways to commercial liftoff report specifically for VPPs, which is a great report. If people haven't read that thing back to back or back to front, it's really worth doing. But we connected with the report's lead author, Jen Downing, and Jen's been tremendously supportive of this model tariff work with advice and introductions. and also insight into how it nests within their broader survey of the VPP landscape. But anyway, after talking with Jen, it seemed like we're on the right track. So the next step was to find someone to actually draft the tariff language. And so for this, we reached out to Baron Argetsinger and Tim Lindell at Keys and Fox, who most of you probably know either personally or through their firm, which works all over the country on DER and DG issues. They too were interested. So Brad and I then met with Anya and Glenn at Sun, who enthusiastically agreed to sponsor the project, and we were kind of off to the races. In terms of the actual research, excuse me, we've really focused on trying to understand the real world experience of VPP practitioners and functioning VPP programs. So we did a lot of interviews with stakeholders from utilities, OEMs, software providers, other market participants, solar developers, and industry advocates, among others. And everybody was really interested in this topic, engaged and generous with their time, and willing, kind of more than willing, like eager to share experience and insights. And as I said, we also surveyed existing programs to kind of understand what helped them work to a greater or lesser degree. And I really want to thank everyone who helped out with the project. So the first iteration of the model tariff is now available, and obviously it couldn't be a more crucial time for VPP program development. As we all know, between fossil generator retirements, data center development, building electrification, transportation electrification, the amount of load that will need to be met with new resources is growing at a rate we haven't seen in decades. And this means that investment to meet that new demand is happening on a commensurately massive scale. So we're making lots of decisions and locking them in and spending money now that's going to frame the electric power system for the next 30 years. And we all know that left to its own devices, the kind of existing ecosystem participants are not going to plan to leverage DERs to meet this load growth. The people in this webinar and others like us are going to have to make it happen. And to this end, for VPPs to succeed in the context of these ongoing grid mod efforts, we need tools that make VPPs more likely to be considered by legislators and regulators, tools that make VPP programs easier to deploy and utilize, things that make VPP programs more flexible or flexible enough to evolve with technology and grid needs over time, and make them straightforward to implement in any jurisdiction. So in summary, we need a well-designed model tariff that ensures that VPPs can be part of any credible grid modernization strategy to meet load growth while achieving public policy goals around clean energy and climate change, as well as customer-focused goals around affordability and improved resiliency. So speaking for the team here, it's our sincere hope that this model tariff will help do this, thereby accelerating deployment of DERs and implementation of viable VPP programs. So I'm going to now turn it over to Baron to talk about the tariff itself and give some more details, but thanks very much for attending.
Great, thanks, Mark. Well, Liz gets the slide deck up. I guess I just echo Mark. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and look forward to our discussion here on the model tariff. Liz, are you able to put the slides up?
Yeah, working on it. I guess there's a permissions thing that so yeah, it may take me a minute or so more than I thought.
Okay, no problem. We'll just give you a second there. So I'll just while we're waiting for Liz, I'll just do a quick introduction on myself. So my name is Baron Argetsinger. I'm a partner at Keys and Fox. We're a law firm based in San Francisco and Denver, Colorado, and I'm located in New York. And I personally work on a lot of distributed generation and DER policy issues, and in the past number of years, a lot of my work is focused on virtual power plants and regulatory proceedings around the country. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to work with Solar United Neighbors on developing this model tariff, and to really draw from the experience that we've had in working on these types of proceedings and these types of programs with different utilities and different regulators across the country, to help try to draw some best practices and kind of work through what's worked well, what maybe has not worked as well, try to come up with a program like Mark had said that is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time that we want to try to do a virtual power plant program in a new state or new utility territory. So why don't we go ahead and jump right in? We can go to the next slide, Liz. So this graphic is from the Department of Energy's commercial liftoff report for virtual power plants. And it's, just describing something that I think, a lot of folks in this space are quite familiar with, but it bears emphasizing because the opportunity is so large and it really informs a lot of the motivation for, why we really felt that a model tariff to take to different states around the country could be really, really compelling. So, customer-sited resources, our DERs, whether those are batteries, those are smart thermostats and other load control devices, or EVs, it's energy efficiency, it's all sorts of resources that are located at customer homes and businesses, offer an awful lot of value, not just to the customers who invest in them, but also to ratepayers at large, simply from customers making that customer investment and utilizing them. But we also know from VPP programs, or DPP programs as we're calling them, those operating around the country, that ratepayer value proposition, the value proposition to like kind of the non-participating customer, can be even further enhanced when these resources are operated in coordination with each other, and we can run them, kind of in alignment with specific grid needs during the day. We can incorporate them into long-term utility planning, and we can really start to monetize that value of having these resources on the grid when their operations are coordinated. And so a DPP program provides that pathway to do that. There are a lot of different service opportunities. There's a lot of different elements of sort of the value stack of customer-sited resources. And so that DPP value proposition is dynamic. The early stages of these programs have often focused on a system peak load reduction service. And that's actually, as you see here on this graphic, something that the DOE report really highlighted as, kind of low-hanging fruit for utilizing these resources. And just to, kind of summarize the graphic here, the report estimates we can meet between 10 and 20% of peak demand nationally by 2030 by tripling the current scale of these programs around the country and saving about $10 billion in grid costs annually. And so it's important to clarify too that this is talking about load growth and load that is currently met with existing resources that are anticipated to retire. And so the DOE report's looking at, we've got, coal plants and other plants that are going to be retiring, and that load's going to have to be met with new resources. And we've got new load coming on the system that's going to have to be met with new resources. And so their numbers are looking at that load that's going to have to be met, and we're going to have to build an awful lot of generating resources, of distribution and transmission capacity. And that's part of where that avoided cost value is coming from. If we can get these DPP programs deployed at scale, there's a really significant opportunity to provide meaningful financial benefits to not just the participating customers, but to ratepayers at large. Next slide, please, Liz. So as Mark mentioned, the Solar United Neighbors VPP initiative kicked off really in earnest last year to develop some tools to help meet this really significant opportunity that's before us. The liftoff report provides, I think, a really good summary of some of the challenges that need to be overcome to accelerate distributed power plant programs and to accelerate that adoption at scale, especially, that is needed to reach those targets of meeting, for instance, that 10 to 20% of peak load by 2030 with virtual power plant, distributed power plant programs. This graphic is from the liftoff report, and the recommendation 3 is really a key organizing principle of the model tariff that we really honed in on, especially based on those parts that Mark touched on earlier, just what we've seen in kind of the start and stop of VPP program development around the country. And so we really looked at this one as a recommendation that if we can get some standardization in VPP programs, it'll make it a lot easier for industry participants to participate across jurisdictions and in different utility service territories. And it also helps utilities to learn from the experience of other utilities that have, you know, kind of been earlier movers on it, that a utility who's interested in doing this and who wants to have a DPP program, but doesn't have a lot of experience with it, can look to the expertise and the lessons learned from utilities that went before them, and then adapt those programs to meet their specific needs. And so an important thing to, I think, keep in mind is that not all DPP programs are, you know, it's not a one size fits all, but there are a lot of common elements that are going to make up a viable program. And so that's what we set out to achieve with the model tariff. And in doing so, we also unlock and help advance a number of these other recommendations that are talked about in the DOE report. So through a standard offer, open access, tariff-based model that we developed, you help to expand the adoption and equitable benefits to a wider array of customers. A open access and standard offer program with you know, standardized enrollment procedures helps to simplify enrollment in these programs and get these customers to not just adopt a DER, but to make it available for use to meet grid needs and get them in the programs, which has really been a difficult component as well. And then it also just provides mechanisms to for the utility to integrate these programs and the capacity that are available to them into their utility planning. And it creates new avenues for utility earning opportunities under performance-based mechanisms or, you know, performance incentives or other pieces that utility regulators can then start to layer into the regulatory paradigm to help continue to advance these programs and help as they meet public policy goals beyond just you know, your typical utility operational components. So when we go to the next slide, Liz. So this graphic depicts the general program architecture of the model tariff. This is a key piece of the overall program design. So we just wanted to kind of provide this visual depiction of the program framework really and how it's designed. First, we wanted the program to be flexible to allow for different types of DER technologies to participate. But at the same time, don't want to, you know, sort of have certain characteristics or limitations of any one particular technology dictate the participation framework and value proposition and the potential grid value that you can get for another technology that simply has different capabilities and operational characteristics. So the program is deliberately designed to provide separate participation riders for currently for batteries. And then there are additional riders that can be layered on very easily and operated sort of overall in coordination, but there are different operating parameters and compensation rates and other elements of how a customer will participate with non-batteries. So for instance, your smart thermostats, your controllable water heaters, so on and so forth. And then electric vehicles is another really key piece to try to unlock through whether it's, you know, charging specific charging times and incentives for that, or as we start to advance towards kind of the V2X, vehicle to home, vehicle to grid type of capabilities, want to be able to create a tariff that is forward-looking and saying we can implement a program in the very near term with batteries, which is a really low-hanging fruit and a critical component with a lot of capability. We can continue to operate our traditional demand response programs in coordination with those batteries, but under their own operational parameters. And we want to be able to make sure that we can layer on additional technologies as they come. So for instance, in the very near term, we're looking towards electric vehicles being a really substantial component of DPP programs. So underneath each of these kind of technology riders, it's just sort of contemplating different grid services that each each technology could potentially provide. So why don't we go from there? We go to the next slide, Liz. So some additional design features of the model tariff are outlined in this slide. There are a few, in addition to kind of these critical pieces that are integrated into the tariff itself, there are some kind of design principles that are reflected here that I think are worth touching on. And so we'll talk about those a little bit as we kind of work through each of these design elements. So we talked a little bit about the open access standard offer element of the tariff. Another key piece I think to just emphasize is this is a utility administered program. These are intended to be operated at the retail level. We focused on residential and light commercial customers initially. We talked about the eligible technologies, the enrollment and participation, providing flexibility here, but with a real emphasis on, acknowledging that the aggregator component, the aggregator participant is a crucial element to successful DPP programs, and providing some flexibility for utilities to implement these programs via either a scheduled dispatch protocol or a remote dispatch protocol, depending on what those capabilities are within a specific utility territory. We talked about the services that are included currently under the battery program that is in the model tariff right now. It's a system peak load reduction service, but there's that ability to readily incorporate additional services over time. And the communication capabilities, this is a really important one as well. And it's basically just acknowledging that there are a number of capabilities that are out there and that OEMs and aggregators and battery developers have integrated in with different utilities. But we want to make sure that these capabilities can be enabled in a new program and that we don't move too quickly to requiring a narrow set of standards that has to be it would be the only way to sort of participate in the program. We want to keep that open and allow as many of the industry participants to participate as long as they're able to meet these communication requirements and meet the other requirements of the program. For the battery storage program in particular, it's important to note too that we're talking about measuring performance at the device level. This takes into account that batteries have the capability to not just reduce customer load, but also export power to the grid. And so that goes back to one of those principles we were talking about before, kind of the different operating characteristics of different technologies that would be participating in these programs. So for instance, the difference between a battery and a smart thermostat. And then, the compensation component, this is different in different states, and the ultimate value is going to depend on a number of different characteristics or the grid needs and kind of what some of those avoided costs are and the policy goals in that state. But one thing that we have seen that we think has been successful in different states is that if there's an upfront payment component that you also really try to target lower and moderate income customers and other designated customers, that you are trying to advance and allow for greater adoption of DERs across the income spectrum, across customers that maybe are in other disadvantaged communities. And then the other key component of the compensation is to have an ongoing performance payment. So the performance payment is really an important design feature that speaks to this principle basically of the ratepayers are paying for services that are delivered. You're not paying upfront a massive amount of payment for a commitment that's 10 years down the road. And then if that battery doesn't perform, then there's a whole lot of administrative process of potentially clawing back some of that money that was provided to the customer if they drop out of the program or they don't perform. Performance payment structure allows for reporting of the performance data, and then you get payment based on how you actually perform during the grid events. And then just lastly, on these program design elements, energy exports are a really, really key piece of all of this. And this is especially important in states that no longer operate under the traditional net metering frameworks. And so Hawaii, for instance, that Mark had mentioned, has moved to a post-mem structure where customer energy exports are credited on their bill at less than the retail rate. And so it's a crucial piece of these VPP programs to ensure that customers are indifferent to exporting their energy during a grid event. And so the model tariff incorporates a bill crediting mechanism for energy exports at retail. Exports outside of the grid event are credited at the rate that is under the underlying interconnection tariff. So as a whole, the model tariff sort of incorporates these key principles. One of them is flexibility. That's really key, knowing that not all utilities are going to have all the same needs, and so this thing is adaptable to different utility territories depending on what their needs are. Having a simple program is better than having no program at all. And in Hawaii, the scheduled dispatch program was off the ground in literally a matter of months, and the batteries are just programmed to dispatch at a particular time in window during the day. And there were over 50 megawatts enrolled in a very short order of time in less than 3 years. You have very high customer interest, and we proved this concept to a rather skeptical utility in a time of a grid emergency where they did not have the alternative coming on online to take over for a coal plant that was required to retire. So this is a real and substantial capacity add from what is a really pretty simple program, and the future iterations of that program will incorporate more sophistication. That open access standard offer model provides a really broad base of customer and industry participation, which is crucial. Another piece here, and we'll move on from this slide, is that the program really has to work as a whole. You can't sort of pick and choose a couple of pieces that you like, and then kind of pick and choose some other pieces that basically undermine the viability of the program. So it's that customer certainty, providing them that long-term visibility into what their operating requirements are going to be, and providing industry participants, aggregators, and other service providers who enable these programs to operate that same certainty and the ability to contract with their customers and get them enrolled in these programs, and try to keep those administrative burdens at a minimal to try to really maximize the opportunity for customers to enroll and utilize their resources for the grid services that are beneficial to the utility and all ratepayers. So let's go to the next slide, Liz. So this is an excerpt from that graphic on the slide a couple back that just shows the general idea for the battery storage program option. I wanted to just touch on this one in particular, just quickly to dig in a little bit more on how that particular element of the model tariff is designed. So the highlighted boxes are the services and the sort of operational protocols that are included in the current model tariff. And while we're identifying additional services that can be layered on over time, and this is just a couple of examples of things that we've seen in other jurisdictions, but we haven't developed out in the model tariff yet. It's part of the kind of future iterations that could be adapted. So next slide, Liz. So the system peak reduction service, this is intended as an initial offering, and it's it's kind of what the slide says. It's really there as a base level service, and it's intended to expand eligibility for the program across the utility service territory, and it provides a great pathway to add additional services over time. This is a key design element of the model tariff, and we focused on this specifically as the initial service offering because it really ensures that the program is not limited to just customers in a particular geographic region, and it provides an opportunity to just increase customer enrollment over time and improve the program's ability to serve additional sort of more location-specific needs as those are identified. It just becomes a lot easier to address those types of needs down the road by adding a grid service opportunity to an existing program where you have existing customers already participating in a system peak reduction, and they can just sign up for that additional service and provide that. And that's a lot different than identifying a need sort of as an NWA solution, a non-wires alternative solution candidate, and then going out, doing an RFP for a single service provider and going to try and procure all those new customers specifically for that need. This model provides kind of that stable of resources on the system, and you can more be a little bit more nimble in adapting to potential non-wire alternative opportunities by leveraging this model tariff model by layering on additional service opportunities. This just really quickly on a couple of the other pieces here, we have these just speak to some key elements of the peak reduction service. It's, you know, identifying when's the capability period. This talks about a seasonal one. You know, the example is like a summer peaking utility. The dispatch window is just an example of an evening peak window of 5 to 9. And then it's the dispatch protocol scheduled or remote. These pieces of the tariff are designed to be adaptable to the utility system needs. And so if, you know, the capability period needs to be an annual period, you can adapt that in the tariff to meet those needs. If the dispatch window needs to change, we adapt that in the tariff. But the key thing is that the tariff is, once it's established, you're giving customers that visibility and long-term predictability about how their resources are going to be operating. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. And so basically that wraps up our summary sort of the model tariff itself. And I wanted to just touch on quickly on the next slide, the VPP model legislation, which is another one of the tools that we developed as part of this initiative. And we'll just walk through this really quickly. And if the folks have questions about this, we can talk about it further. But the key piece here is that recognizing that in some jurisdictions, the utility commissions, or there just may be a need for a more affirmative directive to adopt these types of programs. And so the model legislation provides some deployment requirements, and a few of the key elements are establishing a program framework that would enable and lead to a proceeding to adopt something along the lines of the model tariff itself. And you basically take that model tariff and say, here's your program model. Let's make sure we adapt this to meet the needs of the utility here. But you know, we've done a lot of the work up front already. The model legislation provides a mechanism for utility earning opportunities tied to program deployment. It directs regulators to enhance program opportunities for certain customers, low-income customers, other customers, and just try to really expand the equity benefits of these programs and expand access to customers who may traditionally not have access to DERs. So it expands access for folks to help them. When you get those resources, you're not just participating in a grid service program, but you're also able to have better control over your utility bills, and you're getting other benefits from it too. So a really crucial piece for the model legislation to help direct that. And then it provides a mechanism to establish capacity procurement targets for program services focused on system peak demand. So they kind of ratchet up those requirements for customer enrollment and really putting the onus on the utility to get buy-in from the utility to really make these programs work. Next slide, please, Liz. And so then just to wrap it up here, just really quickly, some kind of next steps for Solar United Neighbors and for you know, folks who are working on these issues around the country. The model tariff is available, and the hope is that this can be a tool for folks working in different regulatory proceedings or with their state legislators to advocate for adoption of, you know, viable VPP programs. And our hope is that this model tariff provides, you know, a helpful resource in your work in different states. Solar United Neighbors is involved in multiple proceedings advancing the model tariff currently. And we hope to see that work continue across the country as more folks pick this up and carry it forward. So, you know, we will continue refining the model tariff as we get feedback and we look through implementation opportunities on the battery program, and then building out the EV and non-battery riders as we, you know, continue working with all the different stakeholders on these programs. So we look forward to you folks' feedback and look forward to the rest of the conversation this afternoon. I think that's it for our presentation.
Oh, and Baron, this is Liz. I added one more slide, and we can also circle back to this at the very end, but just in case we get really wrapped up in questions, we'll also put this in the chat, but if people want to coordinate with us, you can reach out to us at advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org. I think we've shared the link in the chat, and we will have a full page coming with links to the resources and more information about distributed or virtual power plants very soon at solarunitedneighbors.org/VPP. Also DPP would work. And then we'll have a public webinar later this fall, so you can stay tuned on that. But wanted to touch on that briefly before we dig into questions. I think we had a lot of great questions that came up. Let's see.
Liz, why don't we start by just running through kind of where we are in different proceedings with the tariff. I don't know if that's better for Glenn or Baron to take, but that there seemed to be some interest in that one, and it's a good way to kick things off while we sort through the rest.
I'm glad to hop in. This is Glenn Brand with Solar United Neighbors. We are in discussions with folks in Virginia, Minnesota, and New Mexico about possibly running a DPP bill similar to the model bill that we were talking about. We've also presented the model in a couple of proceedings and public comments in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and in Maryland, where, as folks probably know, they authorized a VPP program and now are looking to develop the rules for that. We anticipate to do the same in Colorado, which, like Maryland, passed that bill this session. Back to you, Liz.
Okay, did anybody else want to add on to the proceedings and stuff that Glenn mentioned?
I suppose only to say that I think that's because stuff that we were aware of or people who approached us, like the goal is to do this everywhere. So, you know, if you have ideas, don't hold back. But yeah, why don't we move on to another question?
Sure. Okay. John Farrell had a question about, have you done any comparison or evaluation of the transactive energy rate put out by New Hampshire Electric Cooperative? I wonder if it's a decent model for compensation. I know I've heard of that, but I haven't like done a lot of analysis. Baron, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I don't, but if you could share that, I'd be interested in looking at it.
Okay, anybody, Glenn or anybody else want to say anything on that?
Nope, I don't know the details either.
Okay. Can probably dig that up and share it, but maybe not in the next 15 minutes. Abby Foster asked, are retail energy suppliers included as program administrators with the same resources, earnings, and access as utilities? Some retailers are already successfully offering programs like this for commercial, industrial, and residential in markets like Texas, where the regulatory structures and data access are favorable to companies competing with the utility.
So if I heard the question, I think the question was, is the model tariff sort of available or applicable to competitive retail providers? And would it be implementable that way? I do believe so. I think ultimately the question comes down to you know, sort of the jurisdiction and the market rules for the retail providers and how they participate in those markets. And so Texas is a great example of one that is a really innovative model. It's not clear that markets like which markets outside of Texas that model's directly translatable to. So what we've really seen a lot of is the models where the utility is the program administrator. But I think there is growing interest in seeing how that Texas model in particular may be able to be implemented in other states, as there is interest in that. But to answer it directly, like, do we see that happening in the immediate sense? I'm not familiar with it outside of Texas at this point, but certainly if there's additional info on that, really happy to have that sent our way.
Baron, and the key is that the structure accommodates that, the structure that we've developed. So I think you could mostly just read aggregator for retail power provider in the tariff and think of that being the role. So that's where I'd at least start in thinking this through and how this could be adapted if necessary to that context.
Yeah, but I think Abby raises some important points and questions around like the ability or the potential to create a fair playing field when the utilities have access to so much information and resources, and like how to make sure that like other aggregators and things can, play in that realm and compete. I guess I could highlight this question from the chat. Jake Duncan asked, are you planning to have a legislative toolkit? So resources to help communicate the model legislation to state legislators. I think that's a great question. This is obviously a relatively complex thing to communicate to state legislators. So I think that we would like to create some resources on that. And I think in some of our campaigns coming up, for example, I know there's some folks here from Virginia, and I'm excited to work on a campaign there to try to pass legislation. I think there's a whole coalition of folks interested in something connected to our model virtual power plant or distributed power plant bill. So I think we will be generating resources like through that work and our work in other states such as Minnesota and beyond. But yeah, I don't know. Do other folks want to add on to that?
Just to say that, yes, legislative toolkit's on our work list. So thank you for that suggestion, and we know how important that is to get this done.
Okay, wow, there are a lot of questions. So yeah, I don't know, Glenn, if you want to prioritize some. This is a good one I just saw in the chat from Allison. One up. What problems is this model tariff specifically designed to avoid, such as those mentioned that existed in Hawaii? I would like to identify some of the pitfalls that a regulator can avoid by adopting this tariff. I don't know, Mark or Baron, if you want to.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Sure.
just on some level, it's fairly straightforward. It's designed to avoid the problem of getting a useless outcome by conducting a kind of business as usual approach to it, and just taking a long time to get anywhere. So the sort of animating thesis here is that unless you start with something viable, you're not going to end with something viable, without multiple iterations, and that just subjects you on something really important to this kind of incredibly inefficient process of starting something new. And that is true even if you have into all well-intentioned actors or stakeholders in the process who actually want to emerge with something good. And so what we're trying to do here is to say, like, this works, so you may need to tweak it in your jurisdiction to make it appropriate there. But if you start with this, you'll at least start with something that's viable from the get-go, and therefore you're vastly more likely to end your sort of tortured regulatory proceeding with something that can actually be used and deployed and start making a difference. So, Baron, if you want to add to that, but that's the big picture goal.
Yeah, I just add a couple of examples if it's helpful, Allison. So we could look to the Hawaii programs as providing a couple of examples. And, one of them is it's around this principle of like, make sure you get a good program and make sure you get a program in place, even if it's simple. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And that's an example with that scheduled dispatch program. And the counter to that in the Hawaii context is, and we've seen it in other states too, where in Colorado, for instance, where you've got a utility sort of saying, well, we need to have like our own distributed energy resource management system in order to operate a DPP program. And in the Hawaii context, that is still not operational after years and years of the commission begging the utility to move forward with advancing those capabilities or contracting for them and getting that in place. And in the Colorado context, in that proceeding that was an investigatory proceeding, the utility was proposing a utility-owned DERMS as well, which would have cost an awful lot of money and a long lead time for it to develop. And so as one example, the conclusion there is these programs can operate without the utility having to have its own DERMS and us waiting for a really long time for that to happen. And on the back end of that, the utility does not need to have direct control of the resource. And that's where the aggregator comes into play. It's really important. And so as we draw from examples like in Massachusetts, for instance, programs in New York, where we see the aggregator model being able to really stand up quickly and make the distributed customer resources available through a DPP program, it proves that you don't have to have this utility DERMS capability to have a really successful and useful program that can then be adapted over time to incorporate these additional capabilities as they become available. But we don't have to wait for those things to become available to get the programs off the ground. So that's just one example of what the model tariff is designed to kind of avoid.
Hey, Liz, let me grab a couple of these that I think are kind of important. So first, there's one from Steve regarding, I think I'd summarize it as saying, why do you have a different rider for EVs? That's mostly a practical decision by us. There's a lot of efforts ongoing to kind of standardize the V2G protocols and standards and rules. And we just weren't starting from right in the middle of that. And there's a lot of kind of major players involved. And so we just figured that let that kind of work itself out and be integrated by people who are more into the tariff design, by people who are, you know, more in that world all the time. And that meanwhile, we could get going with the kind of stationary storage, but it isn't like a value judgment on stationary versus mobile storage or anything like that. And the next one, Baron, I'd like you to jump in on this one is I'm going to just read it, but this is from Jake. How do you juxtapose implementation of a DPP tariff and a requirement for solar customers to be on a time of use rate? If they're on a TOU rate, there's a fundamental conflict with controlled dispatch during peak hours. So yes, and Baron, take it away.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. And you know, we see that come up in different programs across the country. Some of them, I think the New Hampshire Liberty Utilities pilot program had a TOU rate requirement. In the Hawaii programs, TOU is optional. And you know, you see different variations of this across the country. I think a key piece to think about here, when we're talking with regulators and utilities, and on the when you're developing the program, the fundamental design characteristics, like if you have a TOU rate, you're essentially providing a price signal and asking the customer to sort of not consume energy and not do certain things at a certain time of the day, and encouraging them to try to do it at another time of day based on the price signal. So it's a behavioral response. And as the technology is getting better, some of that stuff can be programmed and it can be somewhat automated. But if the customer has something that they need to do in the evening and they have to use power, that can be very expensive for them. So that TOU rate doesn't guarantee the response that a DPP program can. So the opposite of the TOU is sort of like a peak rate can be almost a penalty to a customer if you're consuming at that time, or if you're consuming a high amount. Whereas a DPP program is basically saying to the customer, we'll pay you money to not do certain things and to let us use your resources at a certain time of day, instead of sort of penalizing you with a high peak rate. And it just provides a different incentive mechanism to customers, for one. And two, I think is really important, is that it provides the utility a much more visibility and certainty that the resource will be there and will perform, because it has a relationship with the aggregator, and it can call on the resource and the aggregator will respond, and the customer is motivated to have their resource participating in that event, because it's going to generate that program payment. So that's that pay for performance kind of element of a DPP program that provides that kind of continued motivation for staying in the program and participating in as many events as possible when they're called. So you're kind of juxtaposing this the motivation to participate, and you're contrasting a customer behavioral response under a TOU rate with a response that is managed by your third party, by your aggregator, that really isn't interrupting the customer experience at all, especially with batteries, because there's no interruption of your smart thermostat, your AC, or those kind of things. And so that's a really important one, and I think that it's something that regulators definitely need to think about when they're implementing these programs. Like, what is that interaction, and how do we make sure that we're providing the right signals to customers to get them enrolled and participating?
Great, thanks, Baron. I think I do see a couple more pretty good questions, but keep them coming if folks have them. From Avery McAvoy, what was the most difficult piece of the tariff to standardize? Or another way of asking that is, what felt most disparate or bespoke across existing VPPs in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll provide, I guess, a couple of examples. I think there's, a number of things that standardization across all utility territories is really difficult, and because there are different needs and there's different operational characteristics. But there are certain pieces that, we talked about before, like the system peak reduction, that are going to be a little bit more, like in terms of a service that you offer, that'll be a little bit more standard. But within those things, one example of it's difficult to standardize is the compensation. So is there one compensation rate that should be applicable for a peak reduction service across all utility service territories? The answer to that is no. It's going to depend on what the avoided costs are, what the public policy goals in that state are going to be, and a number of different factors that are going to play into the determination of what the appropriate compensation rates are going to be. So that's one example of a piece that's very difficult to standardize, and we did not attempt to standardize that in the tariff. So you will see that there is a placeholder value in there, but it is not intended as a one size fits all compensation rate across all utilities.
I did see, this is Brad. I'll turn on my camera too. One question about how to determine the appropriate compensation levels. It was from JD, and I think that's like an important one too, if you want to talk about that. I can read his question if you want. It says, do you have thoughts on, one, how to determine the appropriate compensation levels, and two, if and how an adder for location-specific value can be added, i.e. batteries on constrained feeders?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of factors that go into the compensation. Some of them are going to be dictated by different states' rules on how you calculate that. We could take Massachusetts, for example, and I'll just kind of list off a couple of the components of the value stack basically there that are integrated into their valuation methodologies. There's there's avoided capacity, there's avoided energy, there's transmission and distribution avoidance, there's social cost of carbon component, there is the demand reduction or demand reduced price effect of the DRIPE component in Massachusetts. Those pieces are kind of a good starting point for looking at the sort of that stack of value that a DPP program can provide. And it's important to recognize that some states kind of require certain requirements or certain elements to be incorporated into kind of an avoided cost calculation. And others will have a different methodology for doing that. And so one of the pieces that is sort of part of this next phase of the work too is to try to help provide some additional guidance on that component to help states as they're working through that valuation piece to make sure that these programs are really capturing the value that they're really providing, that the price that a customer is receiving or that the compensation rates are as reflective as possible of the benefits that are being provided. And then just quickly on that locational piece, that part, kind of going back to the standardization component, it's a really good example of why it's really difficult to standardize a locational service type of model tariff, because those locational service needs are going to be, dictated by the individual locational need, the hosting capacity issues, whatever might be happening for that particular utility in that specific location. That needs to be, kind of iterated on and worked on based on the identified needs. You can take an example of the Green Mountain Power Program. They just sort of took a $100 per kW adder. If you're in a constrained area in a location, we know there's additional value there. We may not be able to get it super granular in terms of the valuation, but we know there's value. We're going to add $100 extra to your upfront payment per kW, and the customer is being compensated for it that way. So there's a little bit of rough justice in that component. Our hope is that you can layer on these additional locational services over time on top of a system peak reduction service and get a little bit more granular. But in the beginning, it's kind of, again, that kind of thing where make it work and kind of work out the details a little bit later, as long as you're getting good value for ratepayers and you know that they're coming out on top and you're motivating customer participation. That's a really key component of getting these programs off the ground and getting a robust customer participation upfront so that you can really start to expand the opportunities over time.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up. I think we answered almost all of the questions. There was a specific question about Indiana. I mean, I think how this is applied in different states is sort of up to advocates and utilities and people in that state. I think Solar United Neighbors is definitely interested in working on that in Indiana. I know Zach here on our team is here and can hopefully connect with folks in Indiana who are interested, and we can hopefully connect with folks interested in other states. I put our email, advocacy@Solar United Neighbors, in the chat, so I encourage people to follow up with us with any questions. We'll let you all know when we have up the webpage with more information, and we'll keep you posted on a webinar coming up this fall. But yeah, really appreciate everyone coming and all of your great questions and everyone who helped us develop this model tariff and the legislation. Really appreciate all the work Barron and Mark and Brad and Glenn and everyone have put into this. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Liz. Take care.